He was humiliated in broad daylight, mocked for his voice, dismissed for the color of his skin, and publicly treated like a trespasser in a place he rightfully belonged. But no one at that airport knew the storm they had just triggered. The man they shoved aside without hesitation never raised his voice, never fought back with anger. Yet within hours, everything around them, funding, reputations, entire careers, would begin to unravel. This wasn't just another story about a flight gone wrong. This was a reckoning, set against the polished floors and polished smiles of one of the busiest airports in the country. What unfolded wasn't a security issue or a boarding mix-up. It was a revelation of how deep bias can run when it thinks no one is watching. A black man stepped into first class, calm, composed, dignified. And what happened next would expose far more than ignorance. This is the first chapter of a true turning point, a series of events where injustice was captured, consequences were inevitable, and silence held more power than rage. If stories of truth, justice, and shocking reversals matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What would you have done in that moment? Have you ever? Eddington International buzzed with its usual 7 a.m. frenzy, the kind that pressed against the skin like static. Announcements barked overhead, echoing across glass and marble, cutting through conversations and the drag of roller bags. Colby Mathers stood stiff behind the TSA counter, one hand resting casually on the desk, the other adjusting the hem of his navy vest. He wasn't new to this job. He had been working security for 4 years now, but he carried himself like a man who thought he should be running the entire terminal. He liked the way the badge looked clipped to his shirt. He liked the way some passengers flinched at the word "sir." He liked the way it felt to decide who got through without hassle and who got questioned. This morning, Colby was already in that rhythm, barking out commands to bleary-eyed travelers, ignoring apologies and polite greetings, scanning boarding passes with the grace of a man swatting flies. Then the old man stepped forward. He wore a camel-colored overcoat and walked with a dark cherrywood cane, his movement steady but slowed. His fedora sat low but firm over tight gray curls. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and deliberate, stretching each vowel in that thick southern cadence that made the word departure sound like departure. That single word pulled the corners of Colby's mouth upward in instant ridicule. The old man didn't seem to notice at first, but Colby leaned slightly forward, tilted his head, and with mock innocence repeated the word back, drawing it out into caricature. The few passengers behind them paused. A woman in a pantsuit looked up. The man didn't respond, just extended his printed itinerary and ID, his face unreadable. Colby waved the ID away and instead narrowed his eyes, scanning the paper slowly, too slowly, as if searching for a flaw. "Sir, you sure you're in the right section? This here's the priority line. First class international." The old man's only answer was a calm, measured nod. The silence between them seemed to thicken as Colby continued. "Maybe you meant to head over to economy check-in, domestic gates. Happens all the time." The words came with a smile, but there was no warmth in it. The man stood firm, his hands folded neatly over the curved handle of the cane. When he finally did speak, he pointed again at the printout, his voice quiet but unwavering. Colby sighed and scanned the barcode. It lit up green immediately. Boarding confirmed, first class, direct to London Heathrow. His jaw tightened. He tried not to show it. "Well, looks like you're good to go," he said with forced civility, handing back the document like it carried something dirty. "Jet bridge is to your left. First class lounge is the last door on the right." The old man gave a slight tip of his hat, not out of thanks, but perhaps from long habit, and moved forward with that same steady cadence, cane tapping softly with every step. Colby watched him go. Then, shaking his head, he muttered just loud enough for his colleague to hear, "Did you catch that?" Sounded like he bought that ticket with food stamps. The other agent, a younger woman with a polite but practiced silence, didn't answer. She focused harder on her tablet, suddenly deeply interested in boarding data. Colby didn't care. He chuckled to himself and turned to the next passenger. But the energy had shifted. Around him, there was a stiffness, subtle but undeniable. No one said anything, but the air had cooled. He had endured worse than a condescending agent with a clipped badge and a shallow laugh. Still, his chest felt heavy, and not from age. He could feel the eyes on his back, could sense the judgment clinging to him like airport humidity. Behind him, Colby leaned against his podium, one foot crossed over the other, clearly entertained. He glanced toward his colleague 2 stations down, a tall woman with auburn braids pulled into a tight knot. Charla Westbrook. She was known for quick comebacks and a laugh that always seemed 1 second too loud. When Colby waved and nodded toward the retreating figure of Elston, Charla leaned out just far enough to see, her lips curling upward. "Oh, he's looking for the Greyhound terminal," she said, loud enough for a few people in line to catch it. "Bless his heart. Someone tell Grandpa he made a wrong turn." Colby barked a short laugh and pretended to press something on his earpiece. His voice rose as he spoke into the radio, calling for an interpreter. "Can we get someone who speaks Mississippi? Or is it Old Testament?" His tone dripped with mock concern. The woman behind Elston, a middle-aged passenger in athleisure and noise-canceling headphones around her neck, visibly stiffened. She watched the older man shuffle down the corridor, her expression twisting into something uncertain, something unsettled. But she said nothing. No one did. Charla raised her brows as if to say, "Did I lie?" and went back to processing boarding passes. But the damage was done. It floated in the air like bad perfume. Elston had paused at the corner of the lounge entrance, pretending to check his watch, though what he was really doing was calming his breath. Years in public life had taught him control, how to carry humiliation with grace, how to tuck it under your coat and keep walking. He didn't turn around, didn't react. But he heard it all. Every word, every tone, every assumption. And just like that, he decided to make a call. Quietly, discreetly, he pulled out a sleek black phone from his coat's inner pocket. The screen lit with a fingerprint. One number. No search. No scroll. It rang once. Then again. Then connected. From the outside, he looked like any older man checking a message or confirming a gate number. But his voice, low and clipped, carried purpose. The kind of purpose that made consequences move. While he spoke, just past the security line, Colby continued the charade. He turned to a nearby gate agent and said the old-timer probably got lost after bingo night, still using printed maps and asking where the stewardess is. Charla added that maybe someone should show him how to use Google Translate. Passengers glanced up. Some chuckled awkwardly. Others looked away. One man in a blue blazer muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like shameful, but didn't say it again. Meanwhile, Elston finished his call. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for backup. He simply confirmed something. A schedule, a name, a location, then ended the call and slipped the phone back inside his coat. The lounge attendant, a young man named Levi, stepped from behind the frosted glass door. He blinked when he saw Elston, then nodded as if recognizing something important. Without hesitation, Levi stepped forward, greeted him with calm authority, and took the boarding pass from Elston's hand. After scanning it, Levi's eyes flicked briefly toward the TSA line. Then he nodded respectfully and motioned him through the priority entrance, not even questioning credentials. As Elston disappeared behind the tinted glass and into the quiet sanctum of the lounge, the mood shifted. Charla watched, one brow arched. Colby squinted, suddenly aware that something wasn't tracking. For someone so out of place, that old man sure had access to the kind of doors that didn't open for just anyone. Colby dismissed it with a shrug. Probably some retired pastor flying on someone else's dime, he whispered, almost convincing himself. Inside the lounge, Elston sat near a window with a clear view of the runway. He didn't touch his complimentary drink. He didn't browse his phone. The TSA line had begun to stretch further down the concourse as early delays stacked on top of one another. But Colby wasn't rushing. He relished these moments, the tiny pockets of power where he could assert himself above the people moving through his corridor, especially those he thought didn't belong. And right now, his attention had snapped back to Elston Drexler. The old man had exited the first-class lounge with boarding time approaching, walking once again through the sea of onlookers with the same dignified silence as before, ticket and passport ready, his face still unreadable. He moved with precision, with routine, with the air of someone used to high-security gates and international departures. But Colby wasn't done with him. As Elston approached the scanning gate, Colby's posture shifted, his feet planted wide. He lifted his voice over the ambient noise and said, "Well, look who's back. Maybe now he's had time to download Duolingo." A few passengers chuckled, others looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. Charla, stationed nearby, rolled her eyes with a smirk. Colby took the boarding pass from Elston's hand like he was handling something foreign, something suspect. He waved it once over the scanner, waited. Nothing. The screen stayed blank. Colby squinted, then tried again, this time slower. Still no response. He tapped the side of the reader, glanced over his shoulder, then made a show of sighing dramatically. "Seems like your reservation's having a little trouble, sir," he said, emphasizing the last word with a theatrical politeness that only deepened the insult. Elston said nothing, but his stare remained fixed and steady, unbothered. Colby handed the boarding pass back and said, "System's not reading this. Might want to head over to the rebooking desk, or maybe economy check-in, just to be safe." Behind them, murmurs started. A woman with a briefcase stepped out of line. A couple looked at each other in confusion. But Colby continued. "You know, it's probably a formatting issue," he said loudly, tapping the ticket. "I'm guessing this was printed at home. Sometimes people try to make fake upgrades. Happens more than you think." Charlotte joined in now, nodding like an expert on fraudulent travel. She added that sometimes older passengers mix up terminals, or worse, think a frequent flyer card means they can just stroll into business class. Elston remained still. He made no motion to speak, no attempt to argue, no effort to explain. He simply watched them, his cane gripped loosely in his right hand, the pass returned to his coat pocket with precise calm. Then, slowly, he turned, not to walk away, but to face the growing crowd behind him. Colby, noticing the attention, puffed his chest a bit. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to clear the path if you're not boarding," he said, not even hiding the satisfaction in his voice. But Elston didn't move. He simply stood there for a beat longer, letting the weight of the moment land. The message was clear in his eyes, even if he didn't say it. This wasn't over. Then he walked to the side, without protest, and waited. Colby turned to his station again, chuckling to himself, already waving forward the next passenger. But something in the rhythm of the crowd had shifted. The jokes weren't landing like before. The laughter quieter. The glances longer, more curious. A young woman in line stared after Elston, biting her lip, unsure. A man in a gray suit leaned closer to whisper something to his wife. Charla, now sensing the shift, lowered her voice and focused back on her task. Colby didn't. He muttered one final comment, something about how some people need to take a Greyhound next time until they learn how to navigate a boarding gate. It wasn't just cruelty. It was performance. The need to humiliate, to diminish, to reinforce some imagined hierarchy that Elston had quietly defied simply by walking with pride. Meanwhile, at the far side of the concourse, a phone call was being returned. Colby Mathers, still manning the gate, noticed his presence too. He didn't like being defied, not even silently, especially not by someone who refused to crumble under public pressure. His pride, fragile but inflated, reacted exactly how it always did when confronted by restraint it couldn't control. Colby didn't speak to Elston directly this time. Instead, he raised his voice just enough to draw attention again. Without naming anyone, he mentioned that sometimes counterfeit boarding passes slip through online systems, especially when printed from third-party apps. He added that certain passengers, even those with fancy coats and confident strides, had been known to forge documents. Charla looked up briefly from her post across the rope and frowned, sensing this was spiraling into territory she didn't want to be tied to. But Colby was committed. He gestured toward the nearby security station and said someone ought to double-check the ID of the gentleman waiting over there. He mentioned it casually, as if it were routine, like saying someone left a bag unattended. Within moments, 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, one black, one white, both clearly uncomfortable from the outset. Colby waved them over with a little too much eagerness and pointed toward Elston. Said there was an issue with a boarding mismatch. Said the scanner wasn't reading his pass. Said the man might be trying to board under false information. Elston turned calmly, already holding his credentials. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He simply opened the inside of his coat and handed over a federal identification card, one that bore the seal of the United States and the weight of years in public service. One officer examined it and immediately stiffened, recognizing the clearance level. But Colby wasn't done. He leaned in, voice dripping with condescension, and asked whether the card could have been borrowed or expired or perhaps part of some outdated program no longer in effect. He wasn't asking for verification. He was planting doubt, fertilizing suspicion in front of an audience he knew was watching. Passengers in line turned openly now, no longer hiding their interest. Some whispered. Some raised phones, recording from hip height. Others simply stared, mouths drawn tight, unsure what they were seeing, but instinctively sensing it was wrong. The officer holding the ID didn't look at Colby. Instead, he handed the card back to Elston with a nod that carried more than formality. It carried understanding. Still, Colby stepped forward, placing himself between Elston and the boarding line, and motioned toward the glass door that led away from the gate. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside from the priority zone," he said with faux patience, as if doing the man a favor. He pointed to a space off to the side, just out of earshot, but well within view of the gathered travelers. Elston moved without resistance, only pausing to place his boarding pass and ID back into his coat pocket. He walked slowly, deliberately, his cane tapping the floor with the same rhythm it had all morning. But this time, the sound cut sharper through the air, like a metronome marking time toward something no one could yet name. As he stood in the corner designated for those in question, the whispers grew. A woman asked her husband why the man was being detained. A college student near the window muttered something about racial profiling. A man in an expensive watch shook his head and said this kind of thing didn't happen by accident. Meanwhile, Colby turned back to the gate, scanned another passenger, smiled like nothing happened. But behind the check-in desk, Levi, the lounge attendant from earlier, typed rapidly into a secure terminal. He was tracing a system alert that had come through just minutes ago, one that flagged a back-end seating override in the passenger manifest. It was an override Colby had no clearance to authorize, and the name on that override, Elston Drexler, was tied to an internal tag labeled Strategic Priority Clearance. The code wasn't common. In fact, it hadn't been used in over 6 months, reserved only for high-level personnel connected to infrastructure investment consortia. Levi swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the surveillance camera pointed toward gate D7. He pressed the alert button beneath the desk. Not a panic alarm, not security, but something different, corporate escalation. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in a gray blazer stepped off the elevator on level 3, holding a tablet in one hand and an encrypted badge on the other. She worked for the airport governance liaison office and had only been called into the terminal during emergencies or contractual violations. He relished the aftertaste of power, the way the older man had been quietly ushered aside, the way people in line had turned to watch and then obeyed his command without question. To him, it wasn't just security protocol, it was a performance, and he believed he'd nailed the closing act. Charla walked up from her station with a lukewarm coffee in hand, raising an eyebrow when she reached him. She asked if the situation was resolved, but Colby cut her off with a chuckle. He leaned in slightly and said he had just reminded a certain kind of passenger that not everyone belongs in first class, and sometimes the uniform doesn't lie, but the coat does. Charla didn't laugh, only offered a half smile, but Colby didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the echo of his own authority. He said things like sometimes people need to be reminded that class is earned, not printed on a boarding pass, and sometimes folks think that just because they walk like a big deal, they deserve to fly like one. The words came freely, shamelessly, and loud enough for the passengers closest to the gate to hear. Most turned away. A few shifted uncomfortably. One or two raised their phones, pretending to scroll but angling the lenses just enough to capture the gate, the agent, the aftermath. A group of 4 college students, all seated near the wall opposite the terminal glass, whispered among themselves. One of them, a woman in a yellow hoodie, tapped her screen and muttered something about recording everything. Another nodded and began typing a caption over the video. Colby noticed the glow from the phone screens. He narrowed his eyes. As boarding continued, he stepped away from his podium and approached them slowly, deliberately, his hands clasped behind his back like a principal walking through a hallway. He asked if they were having trouble with their reservations. They shook their heads. He pointed to the phones. He asked if they were recording inside a security zone. They hesitated. He smiled, but the kind of smile that carried warning rather than warmth. He informed them, casually but with edge, that filming federal employees without permission in controlled areas could be considered disruptive behavior. He added that disruptive passengers are often flagged for secondary screening and sometimes even removed from flights, depending on the carrier's discretion. The students stared at him. One tried to speak, but Colby raised a hand and said, "I'd hate to see someone miss their flight over a few seconds of viral content." After a pause, the phones were lowered. One of the students locked their device and put it in a backpack. Another looked away in silence. Colby turned and walked back toward his podium, the click of his polished shoes sharp against the tile. He felt reinvigorated, reaffirmed. In his mind, this was what discipline looked like. Not the formal kind, but the social kind, the unspoken rulebook of who gets to control a room, who gets to bend the moment to their favor, who walks through a terminal not as staff, but as gatekeeper. He tapped something into his terminal, something meaningless, just to appear busy. He nodded at a flight attendant walking past and offered a throwaway comment about difficult passengers and forged credentials. The attendant didn't respond. A few feet away, the camera in the ceiling above his gate blinked green, a sign of internal sync with the terminal control tower. Colby didn't notice. Behind the scenes, Levi in the executive lounge was now watching multiple feeds on a second screen. He had flagged the video incident, cross-referenced Colby's ID, and uploaded a snapshot of Elston's ID badge from earlier. An internal message had already been sent to the director of operations. It was short and clinical, but damning. Boarding conflict at Gate D7 involving VIP-level stakeholder. Potential misconduct by Agent Mathers, escalating now. Colby remained oblivious. He now sat with one leg up on the edge of the podium, sipping a coffee that had long gone cold, telling a junior gate agent about the encounter. He repeated the highlights with exaggerated flair, mocking Elston's accent, mimicking the way he walked, claiming he almost pulled out a harmonica and sang blues at the counter. The younger agent laughed once, uncertainly, and then quickly excused himself. The nearby intercom chirped softly as a supervisor's voice called Colby to the service desk. Elston Drexler had stood patiently in the designated holding space, his composure never faltering, even as Colby and others treated him like an unwelcome guest at his own event. Now, as the final boarding call echoed overhead, he turned to leave the gate area, moving slowly but deliberately across the polished floor. Each step was measured, his cane tapping with rhythm, but as he neared the wide glass exit toward the premium lounge corridor, he paused. The old man turned his head ever so slightly, eyes settling on Colby with a stillness that said more than words ever could. It was not a look of anger or vengeance. It was a look of certainty, the kind a seasoned chess player offers an opponent who doesn't yet realize they've already lost. Then, with that same calm, Elston removed his phone from the inner pocket of his overcoat. Not hurried, not flashy. He scrolled once, pressed a contact, and lifted it to his ear. His voice was low and composed. A few words, a name, a flight number, then a simple phrase spoken with quiet finality. And just like that, the call was done. He slid the phone back into his coat, turned, and disappeared down the hall, swallowed by the privacy-tinted glass of the executive tier. Colby never noticed. He was too busy giving himself credit. At the staff desk just past the gate entrance, he leaned casually against the counter, chatting with his direct supervisor, a balding man named Kurt whose attention was split between a clipboard and a tablet. Colby recounted the encounter with flair, exaggerating details, framing the story as a triumph of intuition over disorder. He said he could spot trouble from a mile away, that the guy had the look of someone trying too hard to act important, like he had just wandered in from a Civil War documentary. He laughed at his own joke, mimicking Elston's accent with cartoonish overtones, and claiming he thought the man was going to start reading the Constitution out loud or quoting gospel hymns at the gate. Kurt nodded distractedly, not fully listening, not fully caring, but Colby didn't need approval. He needed an audience. And as far as he was concerned, the performance was still going strong. What he didn't realize was that beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass at the other end of the terminal, a very different conversation had already begun. Upstairs in the airport's operational oversight suite, 3 people stood around a digital briefing screen showing live terminal feeds, security flags, and an internal incident escalation report tagged with Colby's employee ID. The most senior among them, a woman in her early 50s with a navy blazer and a badge marked Infrastructure Partner Access, stared at the monitor with growing intensity. The screen displayed Elston's ID. Next to it, the credentials of the private infrastructure fund he managed. Next to that, a record of correspondence with the Airport Authority Board regarding the $1 billion capital injection scheduled for Q3. A 4th monitor showed a paused video frame, Colby mid-gesture, his mouth open in what appeared to be a mocking expression. Behind him, a blurred figure holding a cane. The audio feed confirmed tone and language that matched harassment. The timestamp was no more than 30 minutes old. The woman, whose nameplate read Ava Remington, turned to her assistant and asked for a real-time location update on Mr. Drexler. Within seconds, a signal pinged from the secure VIP corridor near the private boarding suites. Security had not detained him. In fact, he had used biometric clearance to access the executive side directly. That was when Ava reached for her own phone. Meanwhile, back at the concourse, Colby finally stepped away from the desk and walked toward the break room, whistling lightly, unaware that several passengers had already submitted complaints using the airport's QR-based incident report app. One had uploaded video. Another had tagged the airport on social media. A third had written that they witnessed a federal-level individual being publicly humiliated by TSA personnel, and that it was likely a serious protocol violation. Charla had seen all of this on her terminal feed, but said nothing. She quietly logged out, picked up her bag, and left her shift 10 minutes early. Colby remained blind to it all. In his mind, the matter was closed. A disturbance had been neutralized, order restored, hierarchy reaffirmed. A direct, encrypted email flagged Urgent Level 1 alert landed in the inbox of the Chief Operating Officer, a man named Malcolm Vance, who had spent 15 years steering the airport through global expansions, airline negotiations, and investor boardrooms filled with volatile egos and billion-dollar appetites. But nothing he had managed before prepared him for what he read in the blinking message subject line. With a trembling hand, Malcolm clicked the header: Immediate withdrawal of Capital Commitment National Infrastructure Equity Fund. His eyes raced across the text. It was short, definitive, and without ambiguity. The fund, known internally as NIF, had revoked its $1 billion earmark for the Phase 4 expansion of Eddington International Airport, citing ethical misalignment and breach of investor protocol related to on-site conduct. No hearing, no mediation, no negotiation. Effective immediately. The name on the sender line, A. Remington, Director of Oversight and Strategic Compliance, confirmed the internal escalation was not only real, but irreversible. And beneath her signature, appended with corporate legal backing, stood a final line that made Malcolm's chest seize. Stakeholder concern triggered by Elston A. Drexler. For a brief moment, Malcolm couldn't breathe. He pushed away from the glass desk, knocking over a half-full glass of sparkling water as he stood, heart pounding. The name reverberated in his skull. Elston Drexler. Not a name in some faraway boardroom. Not a line item. Not a passive investor. The Elston Drexler, chairman of the fund, architect of its global aviation strategy, former White House financial advisor under 3 administrations. And he had been here. Today, on their floor, at their gate, treated like nothing, treated like worse than nothing. across the room. His assistant glanced up at the sound of the spilled water. Malcolm waved him off and grabbed the phone, fingers fumbling across the keypad. He called the director of stakeholder relations, barked for a full incident log from Gate D7, demanded all body cam and terminal footage for the last 2 hours. No filters, no edits. He said, "Get me every second and do it now." On another screen, flight logs began syncing. Security feeds compiled into a growing library of digital evidence. An AI engine processed the visuals faster than human eyes could review them. Voice analysis confirmed tone profiles. Colby's sarcasm, the derogatory remarks, the performative mockery. Every word had been recorded. A folder labeled conduct breach. High risk had already been generated and attached to the top of the priority chain. In the operations hub 2 floors below, Ava Remington reviewed the broader consequences. The Phase 4 project had not only been their most ambitious, it had also been their most publicly celebrated, tied to thousands of jobs and regional infrastructure upgrades across the state. The ripple effect of losing that funding would be catastrophic. Delay penalties, loss of investor confidence, political backlash. Her team had already started drafting a statement, but the damage had outrun containment. Ava didn't speak as she watched the playback of Colby's interaction. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough to freeze the air. Meanwhile, in the private terminal suite near the tarmac, Elston Drexler sat in a glass-walled room facing runway 33. He wasn't watching the planes. He was on his second phone call. This one was with the Federal Transportation Ethics Board. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He explained. In the precise, surgical tone of someone who'd negotiated defense budgets and bailout conditions, he recounted the incident, the remarks, the misuse of authority, and the institutional response, or lack thereof. He named no names. He didn't need to. Within the hour, the board sent an internal memo to the FAA. The memo included language like systemic pattern and review of contract-based security staffing. The memo also recommended pause on non-essential federal cooperation with Eddington International until further notice. At Gate D7, Colby stood where he had been all morning, now idly scrolling through social media while sipping a second coffee, still unaware of what had just detonated above his head. He smiled when his name was mentioned in a tweet. A small group of airline employees across terminals began talking. Something had happened. Something big. In the staff corridor, Kurt received a phone call from legal. The call lasted 30 seconds. Anchor segments narrated the timeline. Analysts pointed to the contrast between Elston's composure and the obvious sneer of the TSA agent now publicly identified as Colby Mathers. A scroll of public comments played alongside the footage. People wrote that they recognized that look in Elston's eyes. The look of a man who had swallowed disrespect for decades, but refused to let it alter his grace. Others demanded the agent's firing. Dozens called for a boycott of Eddington International. A prominent civil rights attorney tweeted that this case would set precedent. But the biggest reveal had yet to come. As reporters scrambled to verify the identity of the man in the video, one aviation watchdog group traced the situation back to an internal source at the airport. An operations officer who leaked a redacted memo showing a billion-dollar investor had withdrawn after mistreatment. The name Elston A. Drexler appeared in bold at the top of the page. That was when the public narrative shifted from outrage to awe. Suddenly, people realized they hadn't just watched a man disrespected. They had witnessed one of the most powerful silent rebukes in recent memory. Within minutes, biographical details surfaced. Elston had served as a decorated Air Force commander during the Gulf War. He'd returned home to a nation still slow to accept men like him as equals, but had built a financial empire from nothing, starting with a modest logistics firm before launching a global infrastructure fund now managing over $70 billion in assets. He had donated over $30 million to historically black colleges. He had funded medical clinics in underserved areas. He had paid tuition out of pocket for over 400 students. The detail that struck the hardest, though, came from a small nonprofit in Atlanta that released a photo. It was taken 15 years ago at a scholarship award ceremony. In the center of the image was a much younger Colby Mathers, shaking hands with none other than Elston Drexler, who had funded the grant that helped him attend a private university. The caption read, "One of our proudest scholarship moments." Full circle. A journalist quickly confirmed the story. Colby, who had long hidden his humble roots behind manufactured pride and rehearsed superiority, had in fact been the recipient of one of Elston's earliest education programs. The betrayal now felt heavier, the arrogance sharper. Commentators on television used phrases like poetic injustice, the erasure of legacy, and self-inflicted disgrace. Overnight, Elston's image became a symbol, not of wealth, not of power, but of the moral authority that comes from being dignified in the face of small men drunk on borrowed power. In a Washington, D.C. panel, a former presidential ethics advisor said, "What Mr. Drexler did was not revenge, it was precision accountability." Back at Eddington, the terminal corridors had changed. Travelers whispered his name. Security agents now looked over their shoulders. A temporary memorial of thank you cards appeared on the edge of Gate D7's window, placed there by passengers who had seen the video and wanted to leave something behind. Flowers, notes, drawings from children. A small sign read, "Thank you for showing us what strength really looks like." Elston never responded publicly. He issued no statement. But that silence only fueled the movement. His team declined all interview requests. The only message that emerged came in the form of a single-page press release stating that the Drexler Fund would reevaluate all future partnerships to ensure alignment with values of dignity and equity. Back in a now-empty break room, Colby sat alone. His badge had been deactivated. His phone had been taken. He wasn't allowed to leave yet. Legal was preparing an internal debrief. And at the center of it all stood Colby Mathers, no longer behind a podium, but inside a glass interrogation room on sublevel 2 of the airport's administrative annex. He sat hunched forward, elbows on a steel table, hands folded with a tremble he could no longer hide. A plainclothes officer from the Transportation Ethics Division read from a printed file, while a second agent recorded everything. They asked about his training history, his knowledge of anti-discrimination protocol, his statements during the incident, and whether he understood the gravity of what he had done. Colby, now stripped of the performative bravado he once wore like a uniform, only nodded, muttering responses that grew quieter with each question. He was informed that he had been placed on indefinite unpaid suspension pending formal investigation by the Civil Rights Division under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that charges could include public misconduct and racial discrimination within a federally funded facility. One of the agents slid a printed transcript across the table, which documented his recorded remarks from Gate D7. Colby stared at the page without speaking. The words now looked foreign, heavy, cruel in black and white. The officers didn't need to press further. They told him a representative from the Airport Ethics Review Board would follow up within 24 hours. Then they left the room, and he remained alone under flickering fluorescent light, listening to the hum of the building's air system, the sound of consequences taking root. Upstairs, the executive boardroom was no better. The glass conference wall had been frosted over for privacy, but the tension inside spilled into the hallway like static. The CEO, CFO, and 4 senior directors sat in silence, while representatives from the Department of Transportation and the mayor's office reviewed contract clauses aloud. On-screen graphs showed real-time losses. Nearly 30% of Eddington's capital investment had disappeared overnight. At least 6 other partners had frozen further funding. One logistics giant had pulled its bid to build the cargo wing. The mayor's representative read a prepared statement. This institution failed not only a man, but a moment, and the city will not defend an agency that operates with disregard for its own dignity. Within minutes, 3 resignations were offered. 2 were accepted. 1 was deferred pending audit. Outside the boardroom, PR staff worked feverishly to draft apologies, but most were returned marked insufficient. Union groups began to demand accountability. Aviation watchdogs filed petitions. Flight crews and other terminals refused to report to Gate D7 out of protest. Pilots discussed union action. The ripple was now a wave, and no amount of corporate spin could flatten it. At the same time, the Ethics Review Board met in an emergency closed-door session. They pulled Colby's record, reviewed prior incidents previously brushed aside, and interviewed multiple eyewitnesses from the terminal, including passengers who had submitted statements and video. Testimonies were consistent. Patterns emerged: language, attitude, targeting. Within hours, a recommendation was issued to permanently revoke his security clearance. Charges were drafted, and an official notice was sent to the Department of Justice. That evening, the airport released a public statement. Effective immediately, Mr. Colby Mathers has been terminated for gross misconduct. We recognize the harm caused and accept full institutional responsibility. We are reviewing all related procedures to prevent such violations in the future. The message was too late. The public wasn't listening to statements. They were watching Elston. He had not said a word. He had not called for retribution. He had simply acted, decisively, quietly, with the weight of 1,000 decisions behind his gaze. But the silence was deafening for those who had once laughed. At a news desk that night, a former senator offered commentary. He said, "What happened at Gate D7 wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror. And now the mirror's cracked, and the reflection has consequences." Back at the airport, Colby walked alone down the rear employee corridor, escorted by 2 security officers. He had no access badge, no ID. His name had been removed from the employee directory. As he approached the exit, he looked at the large glass doors leading to the staff lot and whispered under his breath, "I didn't think it would go this far." But it had. And it would go further. The days that followed brought a strange stillness to the life Colby Mathers once knew. Where he had once walked the airport's fluorescent corridors with an air of silent dominance, he now moved through them only in memory, reduced to the blur of a headline, the subject of a cautionary tale. The noise of his downfall had slowed, but not disappeared. It had simply transformed, folding inward, forcing him to sit in the discomfort he had long caused others. His phone no longer rang. His mailbox was empty. The only letter he received that week arrived not from legal counsel or airport administration, but from himself, written in a hand far shakier than he remembered it being. It had taken him 3 nights to compose it, and even then, he had rewritten the beginning several times before settling on the truth. He wrote, "I don't know the first day I learned to doubt people who looked like you, but I know the last day I acted on it. That day at the gate, I didn't see a man. I saw a challenge to my control, and I reacted with arrogance instead of humanity. I've been taught rules, but I was never taught how to examine myself. I want to change that." He sent the letter to the address on the contact sheet for Elston Drexler's foundation, unsure if it would ever be read. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. But a week later, a reply came, short, typed, and signed with a single pen stroke at the bottom of the page. It said, "If you truly want to rebuild what you helped break, meet us this Friday at 9 a.m., Community Center, South Hollow. Room 302. Bring nothing but your willingness to listen." And so on that Friday, wearing the only blazer he hadn't pawned in the aftermath, Colby arrived at a building he had passed 100 times but never entered. The South Hollow Community Center stood across from a playground and beside a church. Its bricks were faded, but its doors were open. He climbed the steps and entered room 302 to find a group of young men and women seated in a semicircle, their chairs facing a whiteboard marked with a phrase rewriting what we were taught. At the front stood a woman named Renee, who introduced herself not as a leader, but as a survivor of silence. She spoke not of Elston, but of experience, of narratives passed down through stares, through absence, through systems that rewarded selective sight. Colby sat quietly at first, then listened harder as others spoke. Days turned to weeks. He returned again and again, not because he was required to. There were no cameras, no press, no officials watching, but because for the first time he began to understand that redemption does not begin with being forgiven. It begins with choosing to change. One afternoon, during a group session on unconscious bias, someone asked if he had ever seen the man again. Colby shook his head, then admitted he wasn't sure he deserved to. But later that week, as he was helping set up chairs for a weekend symposium hosted by the Drexler Foundation. He turned to see a familiar silhouette entering the auditorium. Elston Drexler stood at the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, posture as upright as ever. He looked around the room, then caught Colby's eyes. He walked toward him, not with confrontation, but with composure. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just two men in a room built for conversation. Elston didn't speak immediately. He simply studied the man in front of him, the man who once wielded control with a smile and now held humility with both hands. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Everyone has a beginning. This can be yours." From that moment on, Colby became more than a participant. He began assisting with workshops, not as an expert, but as a student willing to fail forward. He shared his story, not proudly, but honestly. He didn't sanitize his past. He didn't seek applause. He taught others how prejudice can wear a uniform, how it can hide behind jokes, how it can destroy with a shrug. Over time, his presence became a bridge, especially for young men who looked like him, those unsure of how to unlearn what had been quietly embedded into them. His story reminded others that ignorance left unchallenged becomes cruelty, but acknowledged, it can lead to change. Years later, the Drexler Foundation would release a short documentary called Gate 7, featuring voices from that day, passengers, staff, activists, and finally, Colby himself. In it, he sat before the camera, looked into the lens, and said, "I was wrong. Not just that day, but for many days before it. And I'm still learning what it means to be right." The final scene cut to a classroom where Colby stood at a whiteboard, drawing two arrows, one labeled judgment, the other empathy. He asked the students to trace which direction they had learned first, and how far they were willing to walk the other way. Behind him, pinned beside a list of classroom goals, was a small photo. It showed a much younger Colby receiving a scholarship from Elston Drexler. In the background, Elston smiled, not the smile of someone owed anything, but of someone who had always believed in what came after failure. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life narratives. We want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the silence Elston kept, or the moment Colby finally faced himself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here.